Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 11th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. I'm really excited about this week's guest. Honestly, he has been really influential in my work, and I think a lot of other individuals who have ever studied neuroscience, neuroendocrinology, or even biology, kind of writ large, know of Dr. Robert Sapolsky. This one I actually have been holding on to for quite a while. I had some editing issues, but now I'm working with a new editor. So I'm really excited that I can finally unveil this short but very sweet episode. All right, before we dive into it, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that is because those of you who want to support the show to make sure it's free for everyone else, do so, and you do so warmly, and you do so every week. So I want to thank the big supporters of the show at Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/talknerdy. That's where you go if you want to pledge your support. I want to thank Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Rob Schreck, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Jeffrey Perez, Charles Payette, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and last but not least, Jeffrey Sewell. I also want to let you guys know that there's another way you can support the show. It's coming up on the holiday season. And if you visit my website, carasantamaria.com, and you click through to the Talk Nerdy store, I'm doing a fire sale. I'm clearing out all the rest of my stock. It's all 15% off right now if you use the code NERDYHOLIDAY. And the proceeds from that go directly towards supporting the show and paying for things like that wonderful new editor I told you about. All right, guys. I know I said I'm really excited. I say I'm really excited a lot, but this one, I feel like if you read Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers when you were in school, you would know why I'm so excited. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, he is the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor at Stanford University. He's an endocrinologist, a neuroendocrinologist, but he actually holds appointments in a lot of departments there: biology, neurology, neurological sciences, neurosurgery, and he's done a lot of work as well as a primatologist. His new book is called Behave: The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Our Worst. All right, guys, without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Robert Sapolsky. Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
I am incredibly excited to talk about your new book, Behave: The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And I have to make a small admission, and that is that as a student of psychology, like most students of psychology, I read about your work in my textbooks, and I read Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And when I was first offered the opportunity to talk to you about your newest book, I had to jump at the chance, because it's not often you get to sit down with somebody who helped shape your undergrad and also your graduate career. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. That also makes me feel very old, but we'll ignore that.
Oh, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was actually quite a while ago, but don't feel old. Don't feel old.
Don't rub it in.
So this new book, the subtitle is The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Our Worst. And the idea here is a deep dive into some of the more nuanced and complicated aspects of human relationships, really, more than anything. What made you want to tackle this almost impossible topic?
Well, this is going to sound borderline delusional, but I've actually been planning this book since I was an undergraduate, where it struck me, when learning, if you want to make sense of human behavior, you've got to incorporate neurons and genes and hormones and culture and evolution and all that stuff. And it just sort of struck me that at some point, it might be fun to try to write that all up.
Absolutely. And I'm sure it took, a very full career to be able to gain most of the insights that are necessary. And your career is stunningly multidisciplinary. I don't think it's very often in the sciences that we see somebody who has worked in such what I think of as quite different fields, but of course you've managed to relate them between doing kind of the neuroendo work, the hormone and neuroscience and neurochemistry work, but also even some primatology.
Yeah, I think this basically reflects that for many decades, I haven't quite been able to decide if I'm a field primatologist or a lab neurobiologist. So fortunately, I've been able to oscillate between the two.
I love that. And I think that a lot of young people listening who are maybe in the sciences, trying to figure out where they want to go in the sciences, will be comforted by the fact that you can do the things that interest you and you can forge your own path and make a really solid career out of it. And of course, all of that work has contributed to this wonderful volume. So let's dive into this book. I think kind of the first question that a lot of people ask, which you make a pretty solid point, is almost the wrong way to look at it, is, do I do this because of nature or because of nurture?
Yes. And I think by now, here's a phrase which, like, to get a license to teach this sort of stuff, I say this phrase about once an hour, which is to talk about gene-environment interactions. It doesn't make any sense to ask what a gene does, only what it does in a particular environment. And it doesn't make any sense to ask what the effects are of some environment, instead to ask what its effects are with somebody with their particular genotype. And they interact wonderfully, they interact utterly. And then as soon as we get into the trenches of trying to figure out, so what about this particular being, it's just really hard to hold on to the fact that they're just completely, utterly intertwined.
Absolutely. And, we can look at, like you mentioned, the exact same genotype. Often we can do this in laboratory studies with mice, for example, because we're dealing with cloned animals that are genetically identical, and put them in grossly different environments, and they are completely different creatures.
And you can see the same in humans as well, in slightly less controlled experiments. For example, there's this gene jargon that's called MAO alpha, monoxidase alpha, and it's got something to do with brain chemistry. And it comes in a couple of different flavors, a couple of different variants. And it turns out if you have one of those variants, you're significantly more prone towards sort of adult antisocial violence, if and only if you were abused as a child. If you weren't raised in an abusive environment, having this genetic variant has no effect whatsoever. Oh, what does this gene do? It depends on what your childhood was like.
Interesting. And it does seem to be the case that in other examples that are maybe a little less severe than antisocial behavior, childhood difficulty can have lasting effects, neglect, abuse, exposure to atrocities. These kinds of things can have all sorts of ramifications later in life.
Absolutely. And I would say the three most interesting things that emerged in that area about childhood adversity and, footnote in this whole field, environment, adverse or not, doesn't begin at birth. A huge amount of this is also occurring in fetal environment. I guess the first one is, childhood matters, that it influences the adult that you are. We're actually learning a huge amount about the molecular biology of how those early experiences change gene regulation in this one little corner of your brain forever after. So we're understanding mechanistically how it works. Second, we're understanding even circumstances where this could be multi-generational, where childhood experience influences the sort of adult you are in a way that will replicate that experience for your own children, producing the same sort of epigenetically mediated adulthood passed on generationally. The third one, though, is just as you're about to get all pessimistic and throw up your hands, that inevitability, early childhood adversity, and that's it, you're up the creek forever. What we're also learning is virtually none of that stuff is set in stone. All of those things in some ways are reversible. Problem, though, of course, the longer you wait, the more uphill battle it is.
Yeah, it does seem like if there's ever a time to be resilient and ever a time to have that intervention work, it is also in childhood. And sort of outcomes from therapeutic interventions and the like can be dramatic with children who have suffered abuse or these other atrocities. Although, like you said, the longer that you wait, the more ingrained these things become, the more likely they are to be passed on, both in that nurture and that nature kind of, like we said, inextricably linked way. Of course, this does seem to be the source, the fuel, the ammo for things like racism.
Well, yep. And I think with that, we sort of approach one of the great sort of paradoxes in understanding sort of the biology of human behavior, which is we're incredibly prone towards dividing the world into us and them. And we do it automatically. We do it within milliseconds. Parts of our brain have already done it before we're even consciously aware of the who we're looking at. And our brain already is processing some of these key differences along lines of race, gender, age, status signals, things of that sort. And what do you know? Consistently, when we divide the world into us and them, so we're not thrilled about the thems and we're rotten to them in certain circumstances. So, whoa, that looks, again, totally depressing in terms of some inevitabilities there. Where the paradox is while we're incredibly, I think almost inevitably prone towards making these us-them dichotomies, it's incredibly easy to manipulate us as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them, and manipulate things properly. And a them 1 second ago becomes an us in a completely different categorization 2 seconds later. We're constantly shifting which particular us-them divide is dominating our thoughts and emotions.
Yeah, it is interesting how incredibly arbitrary that in-group, out-group line in the sand can be. I mean, obviously, there are some things that evolutionarily seem more salient. You know, do you look like me? Do you speak the same language as I do? You know, are there things about my culture that show that we are from the same and we are not from the same? Whereas so many of those distinctions in modern global society are just completely artificial. You know, these, like, maybe less so the political distinctions, because it does seem to be the case that there are some actual physiological differences between people of different ideological paths. But so many, as you said, of these distinctions are kind of just situationally bound.
Absolutely. And they're signaled, which group you have this membership in is signaled by incredibly arbitrary stuff. Like, you're describing somebody, if you have a certain bent, you'll say, well, guy was he? And you say, oh, you know, he's one of those like Lacoste shirt guys. That carries a world of implications. Or like, you look at two people, an example I sort of look at in the book, look at two people from like 100 yards away with your pair of binoculars, and the only thing you're able to see is one of them is wearing a Stetson hat and the other one is wearing like a Nehru jacket, and you already have a pretty good chance of knowing sort of deep values. Which one of them think that cows are good for eating and which one thinks that cows are good for praying to?
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. And that really will resonate and kind of color all of the decisions and thoughts and behaviors that you have with regards to your interaction with those two individuals, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And what we wind up sort of reflecting there is we're not very good at recognizing who's an us and who's a them in normal animal ways. And for your typical social mammal out there, us is somewhat synonymous with related to you, and it's a matter of just how much of a degree of relatedness you share. And all sorts of other species can innately recognize relatedness by pheromonal signals, things of that sort. We don't do that. We have to think. We have to think who feels so much like a relative that we feel highly affiliated with them, who feels so distant and different from us that it hardly even counts when you say kill them, pseudo-kinship, pseudo-speciation, and we're using constant signals for that. And as a great example, consider sort of inner city gangs and such. What color you wear is enough of a signal to determine who you kill and who you would give your life up for defending.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of these kind of labels, these signals that can be just as simple as, you know, a bandana in your back pocket. You talk a lot in the book about symbols, about this ability to utilize kind of these artificial symbols as cues for that dividing line, and really these gross and intense behavioral decisions we're willing to make based on symbols. The idea of killing somebody over a symbol or giving your own life over a symbol, to me, seems so dramatic. It's very easy, as you're reading about these things, to take a step back and say, well, I would never do that. I don't think that way. But that's just a part of who we are, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it reflects another paradox about our behavior, of which there's many, which is like we humans 40, 50,000 years ago evolved this amazing cognitive capacity for symbols and metaphors and parables and things standing in for other things. And you throw a bunch of pigment on the wall of a cave and it's a picture of an animal and you're a caveman. This is like spectacular. And then paradoxically, our brains handle in a ways that are totally primitive and inaccurate. Say specifically, you feel somebody's pain. You feel someone else's pain. That's a metaphor. Yet there's a part of the brain where there's some neurons there that cannot distinguish between you feeling pain and empathic pain. Or you feel utterly disgusted at somebody's like morally appalling behavior. And in another region of the brain, there's neurons that don't distinguish between moral disgust and you've just bitten into some rancid, rotten food. Or the version I find so amazing, there's like this ancient part of your brain that does like basic plumbing. It tells you something about your body temperature. Are you hot? Are you cold? Yet those same neurons, back when we invented one type of metaphor, somehow got hooskowed into they also mediate whether you think somebody has a warm or cold personality. And what that winds up meaning is our brain's not very accurate at that. If we're like not quite sure, am I disgusted because I just put a whole bunch of toxic food in my mouth? Or am I disgusted because this person looks different from me, lives differently, prays, loves differently from me? What we wind up seeing is where you get the steam to be willing to kill or die for some of these metaphorical things.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. And it kind of makes, I guess, evolutionary conservational sense, right? That these different brain regions would have these kind of dual purposes that operate on different levels. But one really is, I guess, a physical level, and one is this kind of secondary, like you said, metaphorical, emotional, thoughtful level. And to be able to not tell the difference between the two could absolutely wreak havoc on our individual behavior. It makes me wonder, though, is there a significant difference, or have you come across anything in your research for the book or in your writings between these empathic abilities, these abilities to, I guess, think on a less tangible, concrete level between women and men? Because it is difficult when you look through the historical picture at war and you notice that there is a strong male bent to the war of a group.
Yeah, that does kind of pop up in the historical records.
A
And
little bit.
of course, what it raises is just a little bit, whether you're a baboon or a human or a gecko or most anything. And that one's complicated, of course, because the easiest sort of knee-jerk explanation everyone has is, oh, testosterone, that's that hormone that accounts for an incredible percentage of like the world's misery in terms of making males such a total violent pains. But no, when you look more closely, for one thing, it turns out testosterone doesn't cause aggression. What it does is it amplifies pre-existing social tendencies towards aggression. For example, pump up some middle-ranking male monkey with a ton of testosterone, and he doesn't start challenging the high-ranking guys in the group he'd normally cower in front of. He just becomes a totally violent miserable night to all the guys he already has the social sanction to bully. You're just amplifying the pre-existing signal there. But what's most interesting, though, is it turns out testosterone and male aggression is even subtler than that. And this taps into an idea that's called the challenge hypothesis. It's not so much that testosterone influences aggression. It's that testosterone boosts up whatever behaviors are needed in order to protect your status when it's being challenged. Okay, what does that mean? If you're a baboon, if your status is being challenged, 99% of the time, you're going to maintain it with aggression. Challenge, holding on to status, and aggression are absolutely synonymous. But you get to humans, and it's very different because, say, you can put somebody in economic game where you gain status from being generous in your offerings, and amazingly give people testosterone, and they become more generous in their play in that game. In other words, like take a whole bunch of Buddhist monks and shoot them up with tons of testosterone, and they're just going to run amok trying to do acts of random kindness. And what that winds up telling us is the problem isn't that testosterone causes aggression. The problem is that we hand out so damn much status for the right types of aggression.
Interesting. Does it have the same effect on women as it has on men?
Yep. And in lots of ways, the testosterone story, it doesn't cause aggression. It amplifies pre-existing little inter-individual differences. The fact that I've got a little more testosterone today than that guy does or than I had yesterday predicts virtually nothing about behavior. All that applies to females as well, because it turns out the female mammals make a certain amount of testosterone-related hormones, androgens, and from the adrenal gland, adrenal androgens. And remarkably, they have writ small, some of the same behavioral effects, and with a whole lot of the, wait a second, let's not get too simplistic about androgens, take-home message as in males.
Interesting. That is really interesting, this idea that it amplifies things that are already there, because I do think we have an oversimplified view and a shorthand that testosterone equals aggression and testosterone equals violence and strength and control and power. But these are maybe more socially, but also evolutionarily kind of ingrained behaviors that just exist in certain individuals, and all the testosterone does is amplify those. That's fascinating. I would love to talk a little bit about politics, simply because I think that, now is the time, if ever there were a time, to talk about these differences. Yeah. The news cycle.
Humans at their best and worst.
Absolutely. The news cycle is not disappointing within the last few weeks, months. And your discussion of these two groups, whether one is an in-group to you or an out-group to you, or you're somewhere in between, we say conservatives, progressives, we might say liberals and conservatives. Some people like to talk about Democrats and Republicans, although I think that that's a little bit too narrow when we talk about this sort of continuum. And of course, there's a lot of things in between, libertarians, for example. The ways that we identify at this kind of very deep level are not arbitrary, are they? They're not just, oh, these are my friends, this is how I grew up, and so I kind of decided to think along these lines. They really go down to something that's much deeper within us.
Well, it's one of those, it immediately taps into one of the great sort of inevitable debates in these things, is how much do we think, how much do we reason our way to our opinions, actions, and such, versus how much do we feel our way to them. And one of the big themes that's been coming through in behavioral biology is often it's your feelings that are pulling your thinking by the nose, how much the feelings are coming first, and the thinking is rationalizations post hoc to sort of make it all seem sensical. What you see in the political realm is it turns out there's fairly consistent differences between progressives and conservatives in how they feel about things. If you tend to find novelty to be anxiety provoking, if you find ambiguity to be particularly scary, that's a major predictor that your sort of political views are going to be ones that are on the conservative side. On the other hand, if novelty is exciting, exhilarating, you're more likely to be a progressive. If various things ranging from the notion of somebody living very differently from you to looking at, say, a festering wound filled with maggots, if those are really, really easily making you feel, you're more likely to be a social conservative. If instead you have a high threshold for finding things disgusting, you're more likely to be a social progressive. And what's amazing in those cases is these just have to do with sort of viscera, have to do with what things make you anxious that you're not even aware of. And what that winds up meaning is you can shift people's political views by implicitly manipulating some of that visceral stuff. This is one of my all-time favorite studies that sort of I wind up citing in the book, which is put somebody in a room where unbeknownst to them, they are being sort of marinated in the smell of rotten garbage, and people become more politically conservative. You're sitting there just feeling disgusted. Same neurons that do gustatory and olfactory disgust, that do moral disgust, and it fills in a vacuum. Whoa, those neurons are firing like crazy. It must be because they not only do different things than I do, but those different things are disgusting and deplorable and morally condemnable. And you become more conservative about social issues. Doesn't touch your views about economics, about geopolitical stuff. It just shows how much of decision-making is just rumbling with viscera and sort of biology we never even suspect just going on under the surface there.
You know, that's fascinating too, especially the point that you made about how it touches your opinions about social issues, but less so about geopolitical issues or economic issues. Because of course we know that all of those things feed in to our political kind of identities and identifications, yet politicians, and probably more specifically campaign managers for politicians, have a very good understanding of the fact that manipulating the constituency on social issues has a good outcome for their candidates. You see so often that the campaign is all about social issues, whereas these other things that are super salient and necessary to make a determination about a candidate and whether or not they're ideologically aligned just don't get talked about very much.
Because they're not inflammatory in the same way. My guess is there's probably nobody in this country who's willing to get into a fist fight with somebody over our trade policy with Swaziland, for example. Yet, obviously, with social issues, gay rights, abortion, all the usual hot button topics, obviously intensely inflammatory. Another interesting realm with that in terms of political decisions is when we make our decisions who we vote for, it turns out there's all this subliminal stuff going on. We're more likely to vote for candidates who are better looking, who have more symmetrical faces, who are taller, who have squarer jaws if they're male, all sorts of things like that. And another one of those amazing studies, sufficiently so, take a bunch of 5-year-olds and show them pictures of two people who were candidates in some election in some other Western country and say, so you're on a voyage in a boat and you're going to scary places and stuff. And which of these people would you like to be the captain of your ship? And 75% of the time, 5-year-olds pick the person who won the election, knowing nothing more than what this person's face looks like. In other words, on some implicit level, when we're making our decisions about candidates, part of what plays in there is like the residues of, who you'd want to lead your voyage to Candyland to fight off the scary pirates, or who's your favorite Teletubby or something. And it's absurd, but it's very biological and it's very implicit, just rumbling underneath the surface in us.
That is bizarre, but I mean, it does make sense when you really think about it. It doesn't really explain what happened in this last election, but it is a fascinating study nonetheless. And it does make perfect sense. We often make decisions about things emotionally long before we actually consider them intellectually. I mean, this is something that within the skeptic movement, which I find myself being a part of lately, we talk about a lot, is trying to become more aware of our implicit biases, trying to become more aware of all of these psychological phenomena that can be errors in our thinking, and apply logic to our decision making. And that is an uphill battle that nobody can, sufficiently do all the time. So this conversation about decision making, about the timing of decision making, which I think is so brilliantly described in your book, even by the way that you lay out the chapters. It's kind of like the moment of the decision, the moments before the decision, the lifetime leading up to the moment of the decision, the evolutionary history leading up to the moment of the decision. I mean, it's so brilliant how all of these things contribute. But when it comes down to it, it's somehow, at least in the press, but I think it's maybe a natural thing, comes down to this conversation about free will. And that is persnickety, that conversation about free will. And I'm sure you're probably tired of talking about free will at this point, but I would love to hear kind of the Cliff's Notes version of your take on this, wildly complicated topic.
Well, weirdly enough, by now, after obsessing over all of this stuff for most of my lifetime, it doesn't seem a complicated subject anymore, it seems utterly apparent to me that there is no free will. Everything that we do is the end product of sort of the biological antecedents. And what's been complicated is recognizing that not only are the relevant antecedents ones that came a second before or a minute before or a cultural history's worth before. That seems utterly straightforward by now, and on a certain level that floats between what I feel like is a truism by now and a soundbite is free will is just what we call the biology that hasn't been discovered yet. What's incredibly complicated, though, is actually imagining how we're supposed to function as if there's no free will. And it's really hard. And even me with my sitting there, you want me to cite thousands of studies showing there is no free will. And then somebody compliments me on something and I'm all pleased and say thank you instead of saying, no, it's an outcome of my neurons and my hormones and my epigenetics. And it's mighty hard to think that way. And in lots of ways, if it's this hugely difficult challenge as to how we're supposed to think about the world as if there's no free will, at the very least, we should do the hard work of thinking towards that when we think we're understanding behaviors that we're judging harshly.
Do you think that the term free will is a problematic one? I sometimes wonder when I hear philosophical and intellectual conversations about free will, how easy it can be mistaken in the minds of certain individuals as an argument against sort of religious free will.
Well, that one, it depends on what stripe you are arranged from. If you're like a good old Puritan and everything is predetermined, free will is a silly notion, or if free will is something we were given by some deity and thus we got to run with it, or in the paradox that I find really amusing, if free will is such a wonderful gift that was given to us by a deity that we have absolutely no choice but to worship the individual, which seems a little bit of a logical problem there. But in terms of the dangers or the consequences of, at least from my view, thinking there's free will when there isn't, it's pretty straightforward. This erroneous sense that we have agency over all of our behaviors, we're willing to kill people over that sort of erroneous thought. Just ask somebody from the state of Texas. We put people to death over notions that are biologically unsupportable by modern science about our responsibility for our actions. Damage the right part of somebody's brain, and they can tell you the difference between right or wrong, and nonetheless, at the critical juncture, they cannot control their behavior, and it's not an issue of them having a rotten soul or a lack of self-discipline. It's a biological phenomenon that they cannot regulate their behavior at that point. And attributing notions, quaint, archaic, Neanderthalish notions like, frankly, free will, in that case, are the grounds that we put people to death for or lock them away forever for.
It's true, but it's so much more complicated than just, as you said, getting at the root or starting to live as if we understand this phenomenon and making decisions based on our understanding of this phenomenon. The complication comes in when somebody does commit a horrific crime and ultimately didn't have the ability to make a determination about whether or not that was the right thing to do, the appropriate thing to do, the moral thing to do, or simply couldn't physically control their reactionary actions, out of desperation or for whatever reason it happened. What do you do about that societally,
Well, I haven't a clue other than learn about the science. But just as one is about to say, oh, great, a lot of help that is, nonetheless, something I take comfort from is we have been able to do precisely that. In some realms, we do that effortlessly now and still have a society that has semblances of being just and functional. Here's an example. 500 years ago, if you had an epileptic seizure, the most wise, the most reflective, the most insightful, the most bleeding heart liberal of that time would have had an explanation for what it was about, which is you were demonically possessed and there was a therapeutic intervention recommended, which would be to burn you at the stake, because who needs demonically possessed people around here? They're dangerous. And somewhere in the last couple of centuries, we learned, oh, it's not demonic possession, it's a neurological disorder. It's not that this person was sleeping with Satan. They've got screwed up potassium channels in one part of their brain. And we're able to recognize if somebody has a seizure and in the process they knock a glass off the table and shatter it. Oh no, this was not criminal intent to damage home and property. No, it's a neurological disease. It's not their fault. It's not them. It's their disease. And not only have we learned how to completely banish the word, it's blame or forgiveness, but we even know how to constrain it. If somebody has treatment-resistant epilepsy, it's not a good idea that they drive a car. They typically can't. But no one would say that them being unable to drive a car until the epilepsy is under control constitute a case of justice is being meted out properly. You don't get crowds of goiterous Yahoo peasants gathering around and cheering as they burn the epileptic's driver's licenses. No, that's a realm in which we've learned that's a biologically constrained behavior. Here's what you do in order to keep people safe from it. But words like soul or Satan or nonsense like that never come into it. And okay, so it's merely taken us about 500 years to get to that point. So in some ways, that's a model system for we can have a society in which we can at least deal with some things as fully biologically based and to act accordingly and to act without judgment. And things haven't fallen into anarchy.
It's true. We have really gotten away from, that kind of terminology, especially in the courtroom: possession, devil, demon, spirit, soul, this kind of arcane and draconian way of looking at these things. And of course, having punishments that match. But we do still often talk about things like good and evil. It's interesting how that hasn't really left the legal vernacular. I mean, I understand a conversation about morality and ethics, but good and evil, at least to me, are problematic, yet they're pervasive.
Absolutely. And those are words that are or should be irrelevant to how we view human behavior if we are using sort of 21st century knowledge as to what the things are that drive our behavior. And just as one throws up their hands in the air at that point and say, give me a break, you're going to tell me Saddam Hussein or Hitler or who knows who, we can't use words like those. Again, it's so hard for us to conceive of this, but somebody 500 years ago with no less capacity to think critically and reflectively would have used a word like that for people we now recognize as having a neurological disease. It's absurd now to say that, except that in certain parts of the less developed world, there still is that view, but at least in the West, it's absurd to say that it's their biology that's wrong. The word evil, that's ridiculous. And all that's happening is the vast majority of the science that sort of informs us about human behavior now, we knew nothing about 50 years ago or 10 years ago or 2 years ago. All this new stuff is pouring in. All that's going to happen is we're going to learn more more and more examples where, oh, it's a biological constraint, and it's absurd to use words like punishment or retribution or evil or blame.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Robert, I know that I've taken up a lot of your time, and it's been a really enlightening conversation, to say the least. I could probably talk to you for hours, but I need to be able to let you go onto your busy schedule. Before we do that, though, I always close my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions, and I'd be fascinated to hear your responses to those two questions. You ready to dive in?
Sure. A bit trepidously, but sure.
All right, here they are. They're kind of big picture, but I think you think about these things in your everyday life a lot. All right, so when you're thinking about the future, I want you to think in whatever context is relevant to you right now. It could be your own future, the future of your family, your work, the human species, the universe. Two sides of the same coin. The first one is, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night, concerns you the most, worries you the most, preoccupies your mind? But on the flip side of that, what are you the most kind of hopeful and excited and optimistic about?
Okay, optimistic. I might as well start with that one because it's hard for me to ever be optimistic. So I'll just sort of quick get that one out of the way. But one is forced to admit it's a much more compassionate world now than this planet was like 200 years ago. At the time, slavery, spousal abuse, child labor, abuse of animals were just events worldwide. And now, amid absolutely the reality that all of those march on, they're nonetheless much more constrained. People recognize kinship in people they never used to in the past. People adopt someone from the other side of the planet and raise them as a loved member of their family. In the last century, we invented criminal courts. We invented bans on behavior. We invented bans on weapons, international criminal courts, the notion of crimes against humanity. We invented organizations that will deliver relief to disaster victims on the other side of the globe when we give money for it. Where it's become a much more compassionate world, and there's lots of reasons to believe that will continue. And much of that has to do with our increased ability, I think, to take somebody else's perspective and see them as an individual. And where I'm pessimistic about this is the fact that nonetheless, it is so much of an uphill battle, so much of the time to be able to do that. And so many of the most powerful institutions and the most powerful demagogues who harangue us are pushing us in just the opposite direction.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, guys, the book is Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst by Dr. Robert M. Sapolsky. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was really enlightening.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.